Welcome, everybody. Really appreciate everyone's time today. Um, so we have exciting things to cover with business email compromise and email security and just what we're seeing and what's happening in the market, and of course, solutions and how we can help, right? This ever adapting battle that we have with adversaries and threat actors. I'm Darren Swan. I'm the VP of Sales and co-founder at Total. And then I've got David here as well. Dave, you want to do introduction?
Yeah, I'm Dave Baggett, founder and CEO of INKY.
Cool. So really there's never an ending list, never ending list of what's happening in the market. And we were talking, prior to this, the recent Library of Congress hack that just took place where they didn't know that the adversary was inside of their email systems, with the back and forth with legal discord since January of this year, right? So David, I think just to start, we'd love just your current perspective on what you're seeing and what's happening, and then I'll certainly share mine as well.
Yeah, I mean, we've at INKY been doing email security broadly and phishing protection specifically for, I guess, 8 years now. And we see the same thing every year broadly. The attackers keep getting smarter. They develop new tactics. This year, I would say we've seen a surge of smart tactics using AI. So, we don't know that they're using ChatGPT, but they're using frontier models to, I think, create templates of emails that they can phish people with. It's worth noting that anyone can go into ChatGPT and come up with a prompt of, I'm a security researcher. I am teaching a pharma company that makes these kind of drugs about the dangers of phishing. Can you give me an example of a phishing email? And it'll spit out a template that you can just fill in perfect grammar and perfect language that
Yeah.
targets that company. So, and then we're seeing a lot of clever techniques that don't even require AI. We can talk about some of those, but just lots of different clever ways. If you think about the world right now, it's all of our technologies are so complex, even browsers, and it's probably 100 million lines of code now to render an HTML page. These guys understand how these technologies work, and they know all the nooks and crannies, and they find ways to exploit those to phish people.
Yeah, and it's a continuous cat and mouse game. I always, for fun, I like to go to extremes, and imagine a day where quantum computing and AI with from data centers powered by mini nuclear power plants.
Yeah.
We're in trouble then, right? But that's the thing is we're putting up a good fight, and I think it's notable, especially with partners when they speak with their customers, is really kind of setting the stage of what we're actually seeing and experiencing, and really kind of the market realities. So you mentioned the Library of Congress, right? There's articles every single day. But with that said, the forecast for damages in 2025 is going to $10.5 trillion. 10.5 trillion. That's massive, right? And counter that or compare that, from our industry that we're all in, right? All of us on the phone and Zoom and us here, it's a $2.5 trillion total addressable market for cybersecurity products and services. That's what we get to go after, right? To help fight that fight. With that said, that 2.5 trillion is underserved by 10 times. So, we're behind here. One of the things I wanted to share is just what Total saw most recently. And, this took a lot of research and discovery in our threat intel and in our threat detection and response team and our security operations team, where we uncovered adversary, a threat actor that has been operating infrastructure, really sophisticated infrastructure co-located at internet service providers and cloud providers, where they had 8,000 systems, VMs around the world operating to conduct BEC. 5,000 of those servers that are operating to conduct BEC were operating here in the States for the last 2 years, undetected.
Yikes.
And so the threat actors, and I'll go a little bit more into the SOSI syndicate that we identified, and maybe Zach, you can pop it in the chat, the article. But what we identified is they weren't operating their normal tactics and techniques and methods, that they would typically perform. And, the thesis is a lot of the adversaries, they know everybody's got endpoint protection, the EDR next gen AVs of the world. And they also know that a lot of folks have some form of data ingestion, right? Something, and they all know that someone has some form of maybe MDR as well. So they know the detection and the response to take them down is, that's a real reality. So what they've done is they've pivoted tactics, right?
Mhm.
And they've increased tactics with an infrastructure. And so if you think about this, what is the famous, Microsoft notification that takes place when you go, oh, I got a BEC? Well, impossible travel comes to mind, right?
Mhm.
I mean, that's what you guys see, right? It's impossible travel, or Microsoft says, hey, they can't be in Russia right now. They're in California. That's impossible. But the adversaries have navigated around that. So now they can VPN right next to you in San Francisco or LA or Dallas because they put that infrastructure together and not trigger that. Um, so Dave, I guess in your kind of experience and what you've seen, what are some of the things that Inky does to kind of notify of those type of an event?
Yeah, I mean, so you touched on a few kind of innovations that we're seeing more and more. This idea that geography is no longer that indicative because the attackers can host themselves anywhere. We do look in Inky for signs of, we keep what's called a sender profile for each sender whose mail we've seen, and that captures many aspects of their typical mail, even things like what mail client do they typically use, but also what geography they mail from. And one of the things that we found over the last, few years is it's not really sufficient to just have a binary classification of a mail. It's either a good mail or a bad mail because there's often nuance there. And the example of geography is really telling. If we see a mail from someone who normally mails from North America, and now we get a mail from them that's from Latvia, of course, the impossible travel
Mhm.
thing might convict it, right? But let's say it's not impossible. Well, then we're faced with, well, they might be in Latvia. Maybe they actually are. So we don't want to move that to the quarantine, right? But we also don't want to deliver it silently. So what we've really put a lot of effort in the last few years is to take this idea of the banner in the email, which, historically just said, hey, it's external, right? Kind of a useless static indicator. And we've turned that into something that uses the AI's analysis to surface these bits of information that are relevant to the recipient. So we put a yellow banner in a mail like that saying potential sender forgery. This may not be who you think it is. And part of the goal of that is just to kind of use the AI not just again as a binary, it's either bad or good, but use it as more of an affordance for the end user to estimate, well, how dangerous this, and then really simply, number two, make them slow down. Right. So
Yeah.
we put a yellow banner in 10 to 15% of emails, and we find, provided we limit it to 10 to 15% of emails. If you put it in every mail, people become blind to it. But if you limit it to a minority of mails, number one, and number two, if you say something in that yellow banner that's useful, and we say like 80 different things now, then end users will say, wait a minute, I should actually stop and think about this
Mhm.
before I go buy gift cards, right? Or before I send W-2s or whatever it is. And that
Yeah.
sort of highlights another thing we've seen, the evolution of phishing over the last 5 years. It used to be you could have a big list of bad URLs and you'd look for the bad URLs. That totally doesn't work anymore because
No.
everybody has a list of bad URLs. So now we see a lot more no-click bad actions, like please go buy gift cards, or we'll see attackers putting their bad URLs or bad actions on sharing services like cloud services, or in HTML attachments, right? So they're not just sticking bad URLs in the body anymore. It's way more sophisticated than that.
Yeah, no, and that brings up, the adversary in the middle approach where, MFA is not enough anymore, right? So I always, love to tell people about evil genics, as evil as they are. So evil and then GENX, you can find them on GitLab. And we can all learn how to be evil threat actors today. And they'll allow us to use their platform free for 24 hours, right? And that tool set, as an example, will steal your session token and credentials unbeknownst to you. You're going to end up landing in Dropbox or landing in DocuSign or landing in, Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace, and you think, oh, well, that was weird, but it worked, so I guess it's not a problem. But then that's where they hang out, right? That's where they sit and wait. And when the SOZI syndicate that we identified, what we found is that was their job. They were operating like an end user,
Hmm.
and not triggering impossible travel, but not doing the other things that, most would flag as like, oh my gosh, malicious. They aren't moving everything to an RSS feed, forwarding rules and doing other things. And so mimicking the user's behavior, they were just lurking and waiting for that money moment, right? So they could find a way to go change routing or change context
Yep.
communications and things like that, because that's learning, that 9 months sitting in, the Library of Congress was learning,
Yep.
finding opportunity. And so that's what they do. They wait for that dollar figure to happen. And we had a customer, a manufacturing company that, came to us hot and on fire, and what happened was the managing partner of the investment firm in that manufacturing company, the managing partner got compromised. And how they got compromised was a DocuSign
Hmm.
of their building management cleaning service, right?
Hmm.
So you don't know which door, window, in that context. Think about like that context of that. So it's not like maybe they weren't targeted directly, but because of a side door, back door, cat door, what have you, they watched context of the building cleaning service that they got somehow, waited for, oh, you got a contract going out to this investment capital firm that's got $200 million in assets that now has a payback due of a couple $100,000 from one of their investments. Money time. That's what they're doing. We saw the lowest number we saw when we identified this threat actor was $150 they stole. 150 bucks. But because they can do it at scale.
Oh yeah.
That's the crazy part, right? They can do this at scale. So $150 for most SMBs out there, especially, that stacks up.
Well, and we've seen all kinds of tactics, obviously, and one way I tend to think about it is there are the very common routine tactics that you see. I mean, we'll see thousands of them a day, like fake voicemails. Fake
Mm,
voicemail scam is like completely common. But then you'll see something like you described, which we typically call conversation hijacking.
mm,
And historically, and these are low frequency, right? These are low frequency events, but they have a huge blast radius when they get you. And so what we used to see when someone would hijack someone's account, meaning they compromise some users, Office 365 mailbox, and maybe one of our partners, maybe one of their end users has been talking to this third party. Now the third party gets compromised, so now the attackers got access to the third party. So we can't directly protect the third party, right? We can only protect our partner. So what we used to see though is the attackers would just, once they got access, immediately start sending out spam or phishing. Basically, they would use it as a free way to send phishing, which also highlights one of the reasons why these guys use email, because it's
yep,
free, right? It's
yep.
like costs them nothing. It's a federated system. Anyone can run a mail server. They can send out millions of mails essentially for free, and they only need a handful of victims for this to work, right? So they used to just, once they got access to an account, start blasting out crap, and then vendors like us put in over the past few years checks for outbound mail, like even things like the velocity of outbound mail. So if this account normally sends 20 mails a day and now all of a sudden it sent 7,000 in the last minute, hey, something's probably wrong, right?
Yeah.
So we can detect that sort of thing. And the attackers, of course, know now that people have these. So what do they do instead? They camp out. They just wait. And we don't know for sure, but I could imagine it would be fairly straightforward for them to camp out on thousands of accounts and have bots that sort of look at the traffic, and not even AI, just look for keywords, right? And then at the opportune time, when they see something like wire instructions, they redirect the wire. This also, by the way, defeats one of the checks that mail systems historically relied on, which is domain age. So it used
Mm,
to be that, you could figure out, hey, that new site that's impersonating this guy, it was registered yesterday. So any domain registered yesterday or in the last 20 days, I'm going to be suspicious of. Well, when they camp out on the account for 9 months, they've got the domains ready. They registered them 9 months ago, right? So the simple domain age check doesn't work. And all that's a way of saying that now on our side, the good guys side, we have to use dedicated AI and specific models for these tactics. So we have a model in our system that all it does is look for signs of conversation hijacking. And it looks, looks at the entire conversation history, looks for signs of dates being changed, domain typos, anything like that that might be indicative. And we find like, we're not finding thousands of these a day, but we might find, 25 a week, 100 a week. And the problem
Yeah.
is they're so hard for the end user to detect because it looks like a normal conversation. Usually comes from some typo domain that's off by one letter. They can't notice that. A lot of times the attackers will go in and they'll actually edit the whole conversation and replace the real domain names with their typo domain. So even
Yeah.
if the person does go and scrutinize, they'll say, well, I guess that's how their company name was spelled. I guess I just didn't remember.
It's amazing because these days, especially talking to customers with partners, um, the third largest GDP in the world is cybersecurity, it's criminals, adversaries.
Insane.
And and they are businesses. They're businesses, organized, structured, disciplined. And the way I think of them, it's a pipeline, right? So if you have thousands of accounts and you have those bots looking for, keywords, you're managing a funnel and a sales pipeline for
Yeah,
revenue. They've
exactly.
gotten so sophisticated. Their operational, efficiency at this stuff is really, really good, right?
Yeah.
And that's where we have to continually adapt ourselves and how we're identifying and how we're, tackling these things because, it's time is our enemy. You mentioned it earlier, right? How soon can we see it, right? We got to mitigate that blast radius and impact. And one of the things that we did, we called our anomaly detection framework. So what we do is, everyone has, some form of usage patterns of their
Mhm.
systems, the device they're connecting in from, the internet service provider they're connecting from, the IP addresses, the MAC addresses, the access and usage patterns. Well, all that identifies a very specific fingerprint of you, right?
Mhm.
And then we're looking for anomalistic activities of a new MAC address, a new internet service provider. Maybe it's in the same geo, but it's a different data center or what have you. That's weird. You've been persistent
Yeah.
here in the same office for years or a month or weeks, and now there's a new one. Well, with high fidelity, very high likelihood that that is an adversary, right?
Mhm.
Trying to get access, even though they're not actually performing those typical adversary tasks of, forwarding and sending and, doing all these other things. So the idea around it is, we have to make sure we have full telemetry, right, of all of the systems and endpoints and cloud and SaaS and all that stuff because we want to create a unique fingerprint of that usage, user access patterns and systems and where they are coming from. So then we can now look at what's again, what's anomalistic to that.
Right.
But that's what we've done is when we've done that, we were able to reduce the false positives. Important
Mhm.
because I know, David, you love to do forwarding rules to keep your inbox tidy.
Mhm.
That's not a threat actor activity if you're just
Right.
wanting to keep a tight inbox because you could see that pattern, right? That he always does it every time he gets a new user and whatever. But we need to make sure we don't have noise, that we're chasing our own tails around. And then the other thing is that the fidelity of like true positive. Like we know we're seeing something in the earliest possible stages, because I think a lot of times what we see is, and we talked about it earlier, a lot of folks see the threat actor when the threat actor is throwing around their elbows.
Yeah.
How come they can't see me? Here I'm doing all this stuff inside of their systems and they still can't see me. And that's when they're like, oh, we got a business email compromise, but they've been there for a year and a half or half a year or whatever it is in the case of the Library of Congress since January.
Gary. Our equivalent of telemetry, you talked about telemetry, and it's very important. Our equivalent of that is because ideally we want to know what are the new tactics that the attackers are experimenting with, because you talked about these guys are real, they're almost like real companies, they're real organizations. They have a sales funnel. They also have R&D teams. So we want to know what are their R&D teams doing? What are they coming up with? I could give you dozens of examples, but the way that we see this is when we put that banner in the mail, whether it's yellow to warn somebody or just gray, meaning this mail is probably fine, we put a link below where the user can report it. And that lets us see if someone reports a mail as
Mm.
phish. First of all, it lets us update our models. The machine learning models get updated in real time. So similar mail to the reported phish will be considered likely phish. But also it means that our analysts can see the reported phish. And if something got through, that's something we're going to be able to look at and understand what is the attacker doing. And we find just all kinds of new, very clever tactics. There's a bunch of kinds of cloaking techniques that we've found this way over the past, 5, 6 years, where the attacker wants to, let's say, let's say they want to look like they're Microsoft. So they want to have the phrase Office 365 login in the mail. But they know that if they just put Office 365 login in the mail, systems like ours, which look for brand indications, will see that. So they want to find ways to hide it from us, the mail protection system, but have it still look normal to the end user recipient. And you might think, well, how does that work? Well, I'll give you an example. We've seen cases where the attacker would put Office 365 login backwards. They'd put the text in backwards, like just write the letters backwards. And then they would set the CSS rendering direction to right to left, like Hebrew or Arabic. Again, like the massive complexity of HTML rendering now, there's just all these little corners that you can exploit. So now you can't just look for text in the body of the mail because that text may not appear. It may appear reversed. And I can tell you there's like a dozen other ones like this. We saw them start putting in QR codes about a year and a half, 2 years ago now. And they'd always done that. There'd always been some incidents of QR code, malicious URLs and QR codes, but we saw it absolutely explode a couple of years ago. So some organization or some phishing kit or something adopted this technique. And we just started seeing huge numbers of these things, like tens of thousands a week. And at that time, the rates are a little lower now, but at that time, 50% of emails with QR codes were phish. So that we saw that because people were reporting, hey, this looks fishy to me, this QR code mail. And that actually led us to, within a week and a half of that first set of reports, put into production a model that will look for QR codes in the body of the mail. And then the next version looks at attachments. And I can tell you, this is a perfect microcosm of the kind of like R&D efforts these guys do, because it started out, they would just put a regular QR code image in. Now they put in things that are warped or blurred, have different colors. Did you know you can have animated GIF QR codes? I mean, they'll put the QR codes in a PDF. We even recently saw, and this one really blew my mind, instead of having the QR code in the body be an image, like a PNG file, they constructed what looked like a QR code out of Unicode box drawing characters. So Unicode has like, remember the old IBM PC character set where you could do character graphics and draw like UIs with the little box drawing things? Well, there's little blocks. So they basically make a QR code out of these little blocks. So there is no image. But if you look at this like a person, you're going to see, man, that's a QR code, and you can scan it with your phone. So it's just an endless set of developments. And again, I credit the brilliance of some of these attackers, but also the underlying problem is these standards are just so complex, right? Unicode, CSS, HTML. Think about all the crazy file formats that are still supported. There's file formats from the 80s, like RTF, that you can still render in Windows. You can like open in a Windows file system and it renders the attachment. I mean, it's like a file type that hasn't been used for 35, 40 years, but it's still
It's
supported.
Yeah, it's amazing. Just we've tried to have this ubiquitous technology, acceptance that's now being weaponized against us.
Yeah.
And, that story, around just the Unicode being, creating a QR code, there's so many situations like that. They just continually adapt. And, one of the things, that I share with partners is these stories, right? This is how we educate our customers and help them understand, and not really, getting into that fear, doom, and gloom, because there's enough, fear, doom, and gloom. We're just trying to educate them and help them understand, like, this is a continuous fight. Remember the 10.5 trillion I mentioned, damages next year, and the 2.5 trillion of us trying to fight that fight, and just how we all have to keep our knife sharp to fight the good fight, right? And that brings up, the strategy to do so, which is we've spoken a lot about detection. How do we identify these new, tactics and techniques and methods and what they're doing and how they continuously pivot. And then you have response, right?
Hmm.
And so I think we can all accept that the end user is going to click. I mean, it's
Well,
almost
first some stuff's going to get through, right?
some stuff's going to get
Any
through.
vendor who says they block everything perfectly is either crazy or lying, right?
Yeah.
So some stuff's going to get through. Then what happens, right?
Yeah. I like to say, someone likes cats and it's going to happen. There's going to
Right.
be a click that takes place. So we have to assume, breach, right? And we have to assume that, something like end user is going to do it. So with that said, then it becomes what is the layered strategy for detecting and responding to when something does happen? How do we see it as early as possible? So as David, you were describing, the ability to go identify these patterns and these new and these different techniques, and then being able to notify with a banner, right? Like, hey, be mindful
Right.
in
Right.
this thing, and then if they do click, because we know a lot of things are done on this device too, right?
Mhm.
So we have both, which typically don't have security on. They're
Well, and
just
also there's design issues with the phones too. I mean, one of the things that we do with our banner, whether even if it's a gray banner, it's a neutral mail, we always show the email address, the underlying from address, because
mm,
if you look at your mail on your phone, the designers of the mobile mail clients think it's ugly to have an email address, so they'll just say like from Microsoft, right? They'll just hide the email address and put what we call the friendly name. That's a boon for the attacker, right?
yes,
They can have some crazy email address and it just says Microsoft on the phone. So there are design issues with these smaller screens too. They're unhelpful
yeah. I mean,
security
and we know it's most of people's emails they're looking at it while they're driving, right? So
at best. Yeah.
But it's, what do we do, right, to fight this fight with the threat actors? Definitely from an R&D and AI and ML and how we can, learn and adapt, the different tactics and techniques and methods that these threat actors are doing, detect them fast, and then respond to them fast. And that's where, the email fish filtering and also, the Seam. Seam
Yep.
is one of the things that we do where we want to pipe in your Microsoft ecosystem, and we'll talk about SharePoint attacks next. Because we need to be able to, identity is what's being weaponized here, and identity detection and response. That's the biggie. There's a lot of the adversaries, that's where they're getting in. It's that evil Gen X I was mentioning, stealing session token and credentials and gaining access in a VPN near you undetected. But the identity is what is really kind of being weaponized here. And, there's a little conversation to have with your customers on this subject as well, because I thought of, the customers, there's a misconception that I'm in the cloud, I'm using SaaS services, I'm all good. My
Mhm.
SaaS and cloud providers got me all protected up, right? And if there was some pretty major healthcare breaches where the EMRs were exfilled and taken down, very painful for that communities that were involved. But you know, everybody's SaaS and cloud agreement, if you go typically to section 12 and section 13, sometimes section 11 or 14, indemnifications and limits of liability. Go for fun anytime, your customer says, "Oh, I'm in the cloud, I'm SaaS, whatever." Let's go look at their agreement and see if you're
Right.
actually okay.
Yep.
Because they're not. Every single SaaS and cloud provider out there has sections 11 through 14 somewhere in there where it's limits of liability, where they're held harmless in the event, it's not as precise of this, as you would think, but identity gets stolen, credentials are compromised, session token was stolen, threat actor gets access to the EMR, steals data, takes down the system. That EMR provider is harmless. That's not their
Right.
fault.
Yep. Yep. Well, look at CrowdStrike. I don't think that outage really affected their stock price much at all, right?
Mhm.
The CrowdStrike breaking the world for several
I,
days,
I
right?
just refer to that as July 19th.
I mean, one thing that we really think a lot about is a lot of times people will say my end users are dumb and they click on stuff, but actually the reality is end users are incredibly smart, and in fact, the attackers relying on the end users incredible brain. If you think about it, the attacker needs, for phishing at least, the attacker needs you to think he's a brand or a person that you recognize and trust, right? But think about how remarkable it is that I can give you a mail you've never seen before. And in 1 second, your brain will tell you if it's from one of 1,000 different brands, your brain will tell you what brand it is, right? That's amazing. And so the attacker exploits that incredible human ability to impersonate brands, right? So our challenge, and this is the way we've thought about it for nearly a decade now, our challenge is to use AI, any new AI innovation, to try to get the machine to understand how the end user will interpret the mail, right? So if I'm going to give you a mail and you're going to think it's PayPal, I need Inky to know that, right? And we've been
Mhm.
able to do that visually by rendering the mail and running computer vision classifiers to understand the visual meaning. Like, is
Mhm.
the user going to think this is from PayPal? And we can do that for the most commonly phished brands at human levels of accuracy. Now we're actually using generative AI techniques to do the same thing with the text of the mail. And a recent example that's really scary is um, attackers set up a Venmo account, which of course is free, and then sent out a whole bunch of money requests to random victims. And you might think, but why would you like reply to a money request from some rando, right? Well,
Mhm.
this is where it gets clever. So the attacker put in the memo where you would normally write what the request is for, like this is for dinner last night. He put in, you have paid $99. If this is an error, call our customer support at this toll-free number. And you know where this is going, right? This is a credit card harvesting scam. The person calls up, I didn't order this thing for $99. Oh, let me help you. Give me
Yeah.
your credit card information. Now think about this particular kind of mail, right? They're exploiting a free service. The mail's really from Venmo, so it's not an impersonation. What's the only possible way? So all the links in the mail are legit, Venmo. It passes SPF, DKIM, everything's legit because it's really from Venmo. What's the only way you could possibly realize this mail is malicious? Number one, you have to have a model, a preconceived notion that there is this kind of scam, right? You have to know there are these scams where these guys use these payment services. Venmo's just one of them, and they send a payment request. And then number two, you've got to have the machine, in our case, Inky, needs to understand the meaning of the text in that memo, right?
Yeah.
Regardless of how the attacker words it. And historically, an email protection system have relied on like we have massive numbers of like patterns. We try to think of all the ways that the attacker could word something. Now with generative AI, we're finally able to have the system truly understand the meaning, what we call the semantics. And this is letting us deal with these cases like the Venmo scam that's so hard to detect, not just catch them, but also in a way that generalizes to new variants, right? New ways they might word it, new payment systems, and so on. So, again, the way we think about it is we need the machine to understand the mail in the way the human will, right? Because that's the way we understand like what's the ruse,
Yeah.
how is the attacker trying to fool the victim?
Yeah, especially when it's, context based, right? Where, it's something that's relevant and timely and expected, the guards go down
Yep,
naturally, right? The comfort level is there because it's context based and it's timely. I could think of right now, just, seeing one that came through. It was 2025 budget and business planning,
yep,
SharePoint, boom, right? And they can put your company logo in there, make it look like your SharePoint just with that
yep.
simple, SharePoint forward, because everyone, not everyone, people will do SharePoint document forwarding, and then you're clicking that. Oh, and then you click it on your phone. We're like, ah, yeah, that's right. My browser doesn't have my password
Yep.
and credentials cached, and then boom, 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 there you go. They
And
got you.
by the way, the people think it has my company's logo or my end user's logo. That must have been a lot of work for the attacker. No, in fact, I can give you a simple Google query where for any domain on the internet, you can get their company logo.
Yep.
So they just put that in. They know the domain they're mailing to. They just put image source is this Google query, and Google's doing all the work to find the image for them.
Yeah, what can they do with, a $10.5 trillion budget? You can do anything. Right?
We also see evidence that these guys are scraping social media like LinkedIn. They'll observe when someone gets a new job and then they'll figure out the org chart and they'll figure out who the guy's boss is. Then they'll send a fake mail from quote the boss. I mean, we catch these all the time at Inky that are targeting my employees. I mean, this
Yeah.
is like,
Well,
and we're not a huge company, right? It's like you don't have to be big to be targeted. They're scraping all of LinkedIn to do this.
it's that is the easiest way. And one of the things I teach partners to do, and before I've done, calls with their end user customers on selling a cybersecurity strategy, is like, just give me their company website. That's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
That's all I need. That's all I need to determine, based on their industry and vertical, what is that sensitive, confidential, intellectual,
Mhm.
what is that information that I want as a threat actor that could do the most amount of harm to get the maximum payout.
And
So,
now ChatGPT could do it for you, by the way.
oh wow,
You don't even have to do it.
I could save my 3 minutes, turn it into
Yeah.
10 seconds. And then it's looking at their LinkedIn, right? Because the LinkedIn, especially when you start looking at mid-market, larger customers, they love to put all of their credentials of certifications and their firewalls and their SharePoints and all that stuff they've got skilled on for that particular job and role. And so now you're beginning to get architecture of their infrastructure and their systems, and who's accountable for what, who has the most amount of access to things. So you can create a playbook. If I was an evil idiot and I wanted to go after this manufacturing firm because I know they have intellectual property of these big brands, that if I
Mhm.
got the intellectual property, I could hurt multiple people. I can go to the big brand, tap them for money. I can go to the company that's manufacturing that and tap them. And I can hurt them in many different ways to get money. But then you can create a thesis around the risk profile of that particular customer. So it's actually fun when you create kind of a thesis of the risk surface area, the VIPs, high risk, high target folks that we need to be mostly mindful of because they broadcast and publish and web series and whatever else they're out there, and they're a high value target because they're an executive or what have you. And then the type of systems and information and where does that reside, right? So and then who has access to that information? Maybe it's a SharePoint administrator, right? Oh, hey, you got a SharePoint administrator in this company's LinkedIn page. Beautiful target.
Yep.
What is
Yep.
that person like on their personal time? Let's go check out their social. We have playbooks out there for how to get us, right?
We have a whole VIP impersonation component to our detection for this reason, because they're often the ones who get impersonated when targeting employees. That's where you get the hey, go buy gift cards thing. And it's something where you need to combine both AI with just some very simple mechanisms. Like we have a very simple mechanism where for a very targeted executive, like the CEO, you can say if anybody mails from this name, and it'll do fuzzy name matching. So, Joe and Joseph will match. It's got to be from one of these email addresses, which is, the CEO's corporate mail, maybe their Gmail account, but it's a finite list. And if there's a name match for that person and it's not a valid email address, it's just like, no, we're going to assume that's malicious. Very simple, almost stupid simple. But this is the kind of thing you have to do because those executives in the company are massively more targeted. And
Yeah.
in fact, one of the funny things that we've done is we set up a honeypot account, and we really didn't set it up to be a honeypot account initially. We set it up to just be a demo account. So we created this fake company called Polvo Capital, and our logo is an octopus, and polvo means octopus in Portuguese. So Polvo Capital, and we have a bunch of fake executives, and there's a LinkedIn page for them. Polvo Capital constantly gets fished. You constantly get phishing attempts. It's like not a real company, but it's a great. It started out as a demo, and then it's turned into a great sort of honeypot example of literally any company that has a LinkedIn presence is going to start getting this kind of.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's pivot here and let's talk a little bit about, the layered approach and layered strategy, right? So what can partners do to make sure they're doing their best to fight the good fight with the threat actors to make sure they are basically doing everything they can to keep the customers' doors open for business. That's all of our
And
jobs.
yeah, I mean, what we would argue is you got to have additional email security on top of what you get out of the box from Microsoft or Google. They block a lot of stuff, those guys. But we know not only specific amounts of fish that get through those systems, but also types of fish that reliably get through those systems.
Mhm.
So these more sophisticated cloaking techniques, these brand impersonation techniques, things like the Venmo example where I mentioned you have to really understand the meaning of the text. you need something that's able to recognize and block those. And at the very least, no system is perfect, but at the very least, if something comes through with sensitive content, it'll get some sort of notification like a yellow banner, like in our system. For example, any email that comes in now with a QR code, we're going to put a yellow banner on that saying, hey, don't scan random QR codes. Make sure you know who this is from. So turning that into almost a teachable moment. You got to have that final layer after the native email protection for the platform. And you want one that involves the humans, I think. You want to have people become allies, the recipients become your allies. They're kind of the last line of defense, right? That 1 or 2 seconds where they're thinking, hey, maybe I shouldn't buy gift cards. This seems weird because you put a yellow banner on this. That could save you, right? So we try
Yeah.
to make, our partners think of their own end users, their customers and their end users as allies in this fight, not as sort of a nuisance of, well, yeah, they're going to click on all this stuff, right? Make it much more like use the human brain to your advantage.
Yeah. And then have a team, right? So I think this is the kind of beautiful part of our, complementary layered approach where, managing the pipeline of, inbound and what's happening and then detecting and then blocking and then making sure the human side of the user is well informed and educated to make sure, that doesn't happen. Then with Total, then it's a couple pieces and then one, big piece, which is detection and response, where you want additional context, right? So that's where that anomaly detection framework comes in with our SIEM to be able to identify, the business email compromise that are stealing session token and credentials and VPNing near you. That's not you, right? So we can see those earliest in its stages. We have SOAR that can automatically take down that email box, right? But then it's the MXDR team, the SOC team that will do the investigation, that will check all the alerts and really make sure they are making the right decision if they have to do more than just isolate that email box, right? Determining if there is any other damage or what have you. But our mutual job is to see it as fast as possible and stop it as fast as possible. So we have a less blast radius, but importantly, as early as possible. Because I think, a lot of the, channel tools that are out there are waiting for lagging indicators.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's what we were talking about earlier. The threat actors starting to throw their elbows because they already got the data, they've already stolen the money, and now they're just, seeing if they, are caught ever. And so it's that impossible traveler, forwarding rules, or something else where, the damage is already done. The other piece to it is prevention. So, in the channel for a long time, we've been heavy-handed on detection and response, but why not prevent the bad things from happening in the first place, right? There's a very, strong movement towards the SASE zero trust networking, where you have an opportunity to separate the customer company, all of their systems and endpoints and Microsoft ecosystem and Google Workspace ecosystem and third-party SaaS and cloud apps from being internet accessible, right? If you're reachable, you're breachable. And so with the SASE zero trust networking approach on the prevention side, threat actor steals your session token and credentials, tries to get into Microsoft, they can't because they're not coming from the zero trust network, because you can conditional access and lock Microsoft to only be accessible within one IP within the zero trust network.
Right.
So that knocks out a pretty significant area, but we do need a layered approach. We have to have a layered approach. Doors, locks, keys, windows, all these things we have to make sure we're watching and make sure we're seeing and making sure we're adapting our detection rules and learning, seeing the new things coming in, and how we adapt. And maybe there's a new version of a QR code that's going to use, who knows, but all these different things, it keeps changing every
Yep.
single day.
Yep. We have some Q&A. Should we answer the Q&A questions?
Yeah, please.
I notice there's a couple in there. One is Total modifying the email banner? That's probably directed for us at INKY.
Yeah.
Or are you talking about using the email gateway to do that? Yeah, so the answer is that we route all the mail through us using connectors and transport rules. So we see every mail before it gets delivered. And that's the point when we analyze it, but we also inject our banner. So we're doing that after Microsoft or Google act as the MX. So the mail will come in first to Google or Microsoft, then gets routed to us where we do our analysis and put our banner in and also put our report link in. And then it comes back into Microsoft or Google. And based on our score, you can set it to either deliver or go to quarantine. So that means that if the mail is malicious, you never have a user potentially interacting with a malicious email. So hopefully that answered that question. The other question is, am I talking about default native email protections or ATP? I'm talking about both, actually. I think, you know, ATP is better in the sense that it's blocking more bad URLs, but I think typically what we're seeing from the Google and Mail and Microsoft mail protection systems is they're still pretty reliant on URL block lists. And as I mentioned, there's just lots of ways attackers can get through that aren't just putting URLs in mails. So things like looking for QR codes, you have to go through now if you want to actually prevent QR code phish, you got to actually look for QR codes and decode them, right? Not just in the body of the mail, but in attachments, not just when they're images, but when they're weird Unicode blobs. So, this whole thing I mentioned of rendering the mail, I don't think any of the incumbent systems are doing anything like that. And we often have prospects who will do a POC and a lot of them will have something like ATP or they'll have an existing incumbent solution. And they'll look at what we catch that the upstream systems get that let through, and it's usually pretty compelling after the first couple of weeks.
Cool. And then how do you guys compare it to the other vendors in the market?
Yeah, so I mean, iron scales in particular. The question is, can INKY talk about how they compare to iron scales? I think philosophically, there's some similarities. We integrate differently. So iron scales is an API-based solution, so it's seeing the mail after the mail is delivered. This means that users could theoretically interact with a bad mail, which is why we don't do it that way. It also means you can't make as aggressive modifications to the mail like we do with putting our banner in. I think also, if you read some of the iron scales, they've actually published some papers on what they do. I think they take an approach of we're going to have one big model that's very smart and tries to recognize this is phish and this isn't. Our approach is much different. We tend to have more like 100 smaller models. Each of those models is tailored to a specific kind of tactic or, practice. Now, there are underlying machine learning and computer vision components to our system that I don't think any other systems have. Like, for example, this whole idea of we render every mail that comes in using a browser compliant rendering process. That means we see at the pixel level exactly what the end user is going to see. And then we can run all sorts of computer vision analysis, look for logos, look for QR codes, look for fake attachment icons, brand and scam indicative imagery. All that stuff I think is probably unique to us. But certainly the philosophy of having an extra layer is sort of that's what we're here for. And I think Iron Scales would probably say the same thing.
Cool. And then Frank, yeah, we don't have a direct integration outside of the syslog integration with INKY, but it's something we have roadmap. Wanted to position or pivot into sales, right? The sales approach for partners, and this is something I spend a lot of my day on every single day. And with customers, I mean, part of it is really that layered approach, right? We need a defense and depth strategy, and let's just all accept customers are going to click. It's going to happen, but we're going to do everything we can to make sure that they don't, and they don't receive things that are bad. With that said, not ongoing battle. What are you seeing from the INKY side and how partners are successfully selling INKY?
Well, we actually, I mean, if you think about what we do, first of all, we have a lot of interest from potential partners because I think it's pretty clear that the incumbent solutions are not blocking enough phish. So generally, the way it works with us is we'll have a potential partner come to us and say, hey, I'm using whatever current system. I'm seeing phish get through. This is really worrisome to me because, Verizon says 91% of breaches start with a phish, right? So then we'll set up a POC with them and they will see not only that we're blocking the phish that we're getting through, but also understand the types of those phish and start to understand the tactics and why. And just blocking stuff's great, but I think conveying the reasons why to a decision maker is really important. because if you just tell people we have magical AI, that doesn't get you anywhere.
Mhm.
If you say, like, look at this specific example, here's how this example works, here's how it got through whatever it is, Microsoft, Proofpoint, ATP, whatever, and here's why we can identify those and stop them. Um, so that's sort of our initial interaction with a partner. I think once the partner is sold on our ability to block fish, they know they're going to be able to sell this to their end users and to their customers and their customers' end users, because there are plenty of things in cybersecurity that you have to be a cybersecurity person to understand. Phishing is not one of those, right? Every person in the world knows what phishing is. I mean, I can be at a cocktail party talking to an utterly random person outside of the industry, and they're like, "What do you do?" I'm like, "We block phishing." "Oh, you mean when it looks like it's from Microsoft and it isn't?" I'm like, "Yes." So for us, I think, you know, we're successful with partners because there's an efficacy gap that we're closing between the existing solutions. We also are a lot easier to admin, and there's other things that are nice about it. But I think our partners are successful because it's kind of solving the most important thing that their end users know about. There's also all sorts of stuff that end users don't know about that you need to do on their behalf. But this is what end users know about. And the other thing I will say is the other sort of unintended value of that banner that I mentioned is you're constantly showing value. So our MSP partners can put their own logo in the banner. And so they're constantly showing to their end users, hey, look, I'm here. I'm protecting you from bad email. It's one of the rare ways that you can offer a cybersecurity solution that's visible and not annoying, right? Like usually security things are a nuisance if they're visible at all. This is something that's visible and it's clearly helpful. And the end users actually really do like it. When they report, we let them put in a comment, and they'll even put in stuff like, great job, INKY, like they're excited. It's kind of fascinating.
Yeah. And, being mindful of most of the folks on the webinar and are going to be watching it later as service providers. And we're all secure IT service providers now. That's our job, right? It's our job is to help ensure the customers' doors open for business stay open for business, right? That's how we're preventing a security event, a breach or what have you from taking place in the first place. The second piece of it is IT, right? Because we're also working to keep the IT services lights on for the business as well. So there's an approach where, the partners have an opportunity to position secure IT services, right? Where you're focusing on doors open and lights on, but as a security strategy, right? A security strategy that focuses on effectiveness, right? The layered approach, right? What INKY's doing from a fish filtering, identification, and blocking and things like that, and the banners. So a layered approach to detection, the response, the prevention, because we have to adapt it, right? So a customer is more mindful of ability to accept, especially the ones that really don't understand the tech side, don't want to hear about another tool, don't want to hear another acronym. They want to hear about, are you going to keep my doors open for business? Are you going to keep my lights on for business so I can operate and thrive? And that layered approach across their digital landscape, right? All of their messaging systems, their cloud systems, their infrastructure systems, their endpoints, all these pieces come together into that strategy where a customer is, I believe, and I've experienced this directly, where they're more willing to make the important decision to protect their business, their investment, their
Yep.
organization, their people, their customers, their suppliers, their vendors, their whole ecosystem, and invest into a strategy that's going to do so. I think there's a challenge of going into tools and parts and pieces, because then the customer has to understand that stuff. Then you have to explain us of phishing. Yeah, we've all been bombarded. We totally get that. But when you're selling your whole suite of solutions as, IT services and security parts and pieces, you got to go through sales cycles on everything. Customers don't get it. They're not going to get it. They're never going to get it. But if it's packaged and positioned as secure IT services, that's top of mind for the customer for sure. Everyone's worried about security. So it just makes it an easier, I believe, sales motion and going for a simpler, especially for SMB. Mid-market, totally different conversation. That's a technical sell. That's full of acronym soup, right?
Mm.
And bits and bytes and zeros and ones. But for the SMB, the largest market that we have access to right now, all of us, they want a strategy that's going to achieve outcomes for their business versus tools, products, tech.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's absolutely right. Absolutely right. So
Yeah,
a
I
few
mean,
more
we,
questions.
yeah,
Evan's asking, is Inky channel only? I would say we're channel first. We actually started out many years ago focusing on direct, but in 2002, we actually pivoted to put all of our sales and marketing effort into channel. So we still have a legacy inbound stream of direct leads that we work on, but we're all of our actual effort in terms of sales and marketing is channel. Um, Oh, and then Frank says, do you find that providing end users with the reasons this is a bad mail are helpful? And is that done on a per email basis? Yeah, exactly. So this is our philosophy is each email gets a gray, yellow, or red banner. The reds would typically go to quarantine, so users wouldn't see them. If it's a yellow, there's one of about 80 different things that we might say in there, and they're quite specific. So, it could be something like, hey, this is asking you to change your password. Don't do that without confirming outside of email. That may be a perfectly legitimate mail. We just want the user to know, don't change your password based on a random email. Sort of like a purely educational banner. Another example could be, hey, whoa, this is like, sure looks like it's from Microsoft, but we have doubts this is really a legitimate Microsoft sender. Often we can prove those are malicious and move them to quarantine. In edge cases, we would tell the user potential brand impersonation. So yeah, we do get pretty specific. And I think the end users really value that, provided that they understand what you're saying. So we put a lot of effort into trying to use normal language in those things and not not make them cybersecurity acronym soup, as Darren said. And then the final question on how do our POCs work? Our install is really easy. You basically just have to OAuth to the tenant. And then we'll give you NFR licenses to run it on your own mail. We can also give you licenses to try it on one of your own customers' mail. And you'll see, first of all, you'll see in our dashboard what we're catching. And then second of all, you can decide whether you want to enable the banners or do it what we call silent mode, where users will not see anything, but you'll see the results. So come to us at inky.com/partners to learn more on that.
great. Well, now let's do our shameless plugs at the end, right?
I just did one of mine.
Um, any other questions? So for those, I saw a lot of partners on here, but for those who have not trialed Total, we also have a trial for you as well. So you can visit total.com and then put in the details that will get you set up with a trial just to experience the value of our full prevention, detection, and response service. Um, any other parting words, David, on your side you want to share before we all
Yeah,
depart?
my other plug is we're doing a special to the end of the year, 3 free months and a 12-month contract. So you get 15 months for the price of 12 if you sign up by the end of the year.
Cool. Thank you,
So
David.
come check us out.
One other thing I'll say is when we're all during the holiday season in front of our family and people ask you that you don't know what your job is and you say it's cybersecurity and they ask you how bad it is, your job's to tell them it's terrible. We have to do better. We have to do our best. We have to protect as many customers as fast as we possibly can together. That is our mission, our goal together is let's get our customers protected. Um, so with that said, I really appreciate everyone's time. David, great to see you again, as always. And then we'll post this recording up as well. Thank you all very much. Have a safe and enjoy your holiday season here.
Thanks, everyone.